It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. Ha! And I rushed that because I was trying not to cough. Oh, this spring cold is brutal. I don't know if the rest of you guys are, any of you guys are suffering through this, but sorry about that. This is pretty special. But it is Feedback Friday, so I am here with feedback and feedback to your feedback and a question for you guys, as usual. The question of the week right off the top is, some of you may know I'm getting into consulting work as well as public analyst work. And I've asked a few colleagues in the business about what's the best way to go about this, and more notably, what's the best way to include indie game developers who don't have the money to hire things like consultants. And by indie game developers, I'm not talking about AAA developers with AAA connections and AAA experience doing passion projects. I'm talking about, people who are making a game with 9 people sort of thing, or, making the game on their own in their basement. And what we determined the best thing to do was to basically donate, create basically a lottery or an application process sort of thing to allow people to access these sorts of services for free or for low cost, depending on need. But my question for you guys, especially those of you who are indie game developers, what do you think the best application process for this is? Because I know I despise lengthy forms. There's only a basic amount of information. What's really more important to me is the project, and feeling like it's a good use of time, feeling like the project is actually going to get completed, and that it's something sort of robust enough that, it's a good use of services. It's actually helping move up and coming developers, or, developers with this good product that could be great. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about gender. I'm talking about, all the things I do, all the system analysis I do, gameplay analysis, stuff like that. So let me know in the comments what you think the best way to apply is, and what sort of information. Obviously, it would have to be some sort of private form, so that it doesn't, you don't leak information about your IP to the public. But let me know what you guys think. Is like a Google form the best way? Is just an email with submission guidelines the best way? What does everyone prefer? Let me know. So getting into the content for the week, this surprised me that the most commented on video was not Uncharted 4. It wasn't the Jian Ghomeshi stuff. It wasn't the cosplay stuff. It was the video I did out of my own interest on the study on math, anxiety, and gender. And I'm thrilled that people on this YouTube channel are so interested in studies. That's awesome. That's good for me to know. The thing that caught me off guard, that was hard for me to personally read, was the number of times that people who come to my YouTube channel and watch my content talked about how girls are naturally good at things and boys are naturally good at things, forgetting that my interests and my skills are not in line with what is quote unquote natural for girls. And this is precisely the disconnect that got me into looking at gender in the first place. It was basically, why am I weird? I don't feel weird. I feel like I'm the best me I am. And I don't think it's right that I should be put up as abnormal or strange or not natural because I happen to prefer isolated events, small groups, to big, large gatherings, I'm not the most go out and hang with people type of person. I'm not, um, I'm much more logic than feelings driven. I had to sort of develop that emotional awareness, for lack of a better term. That's not quite the right word, but that being one of the good things about doing your Myers-Briggs stuff for the purposes of business is it gives you indications of what things would be better to work with different types of people. And the thing that I had to do is sort of slow it down. Don't go from point A to point B so quickly. Make sure everyone feels involved. Don't be as worried about efficiency. Some inefficiencies are beneficial to make sure everybody feels heard and included. Which is, I mean, you guys might have seen the tweet a few weeks ago that INTJ women are 0.8% of the population. And that makes no sense to me because I am one and this feels like my normal state. And so this is why I start getting into natural. Really, I don't like being told I'm unnatural because it punishes people in both genders who don't conform. And part of my concern about gender and gender stereotypes is, what is the price of conformity? Like, what does it do to achievement? And what does it do to women's ability to excel in business and men's ability to connect in the, for lack of a better term, domestic or family sphere? And so basically what happens to a man who is more interested in raising kids than being high powered in business? There needs to be a role in society for these people. What about women who aren't baby oriented? They're not interested in going out and finding a husband as the penultimate reason for their being. They're interested in careers or interested in building that. That, trust me, guys, really affects your social circle. The older you get, there starts to be a real wedge between people with kids and people without kids. One of the questions that came up was, why does it matter if there are more women in STEM? Why does it matter if women don't like math? Well, first of all, I really think that women don't like math is a misnomer, because if you think about the woman's work sphere of reality, things like cooking and cleaning, these things, I do them. I happen to like cooking and baking, but following recipes is all about fractions. So this idea that there's some sort of aversion to it doesn't make any sense. It's the applications. And then, the other thing is that the reality is that, and I've done segments on this before, male-dominated fields pay more than female-dominated fields. And so when people say, why aren't we trying to get more men into daycare? Well, the reality is some places are. I know that there are places up here that want more men in early childhood education, but it's tough because, first of all, the money's crap. And I think early child educators should get paid more, but then the parents have to pay more for daycare, and that's not happening, so wages are suppressed. But the problem is, when you look at the sciences, the minute women start coming into a science, the wages go down. So there's a problem there. But right now, for the short term, we want more women in STEM because STEM fields pay very well. And there's concerns about women earning less than men to a point. Whatever you want to argue with the numbers, I'm not interested in arguing the numbers about this, that women across the board are earning less than men. The gap is smaller among some racial groups and larger in other racial groups. But, there were other assumptions about what was quote unquote natural for certain people historically that led to some of those gaps. I mean, one of the largest wage gaps is among African Americans, not just African American men to African American women, African American men to white men, and African American women to white women. And then, it's just African Americans earn less. And historically, there was a really nasty belief that African American people were naturally different in critical ways. And of course, different is code for lesser than white people. And it has led to systemic inequalities that are, uniquely affect people in the US because of the history in that country. Now, wonderfully, America has a thriving black middle class now. I was just catching up on Blackish, and they had this scene that the urban division that the main character Blackish runs at the ad agency he works at. The urban division was so successful that now there is no urban market. There is just the market, and so he was at risk of losing his job. And that was very funny, but that was sort of like cool at the same time, because it's true. African American people have made massive strides in the last 30 years or so, and that has a lot to do with what you believe is possible. I know it because I grew up in, predominantly Afro-Caribbean neighborhood. Well, it was a combination of Afro-Caribbean, Muslim immigrant, Arab immigrant, Persians, and then a collection of, there was people from Greece, there were people from places like Ecuador. It was an immigrant neighborhood. And, I saw firsthand people who wanted to be doctors and lawyers and, high-powered professions. The problem that you get into is that there are certain codes, there are certain unwritten things you have to do that people where I grew up didn't know. And the schools don't help, the guidance counselors don't help. They are given kits by various places. Just going to the high school I went to put you at a disadvantage when applying to some of the bigger schools. I had a ridiculously high grade point average, and I got waitlisted at Queen's. And it was because they draw from private schools first. Why? Because private schools are rich people, and so they're looking for alumni who will give money back to the school. As I was always told, you'll get an education, you'll get increased quality of life, you'll have all these doors open to you, people will appreciate you. It was absolute garbage. I came from the wrong neighborhood, I wasn't a cash cow, and it didn't matter how good my grades were. And my grades were ridiculous. I got my grades were at my lowest senior year mark was a 92. And this is not a merit-based system. This is who you know and what's in their bank account. And so when we start talking about artificial barriers to success, these are the things that we talk about. Are some types of people given the same tools to get the same places as other people? And so when you start getting into natural, it's so hard. First of all, individuality trumps gender, trumps race all the time. We've seen that consistently in various studies, not just one. So no, I'm not going to quote one because there is consensus. If people are just following their natural inclinations, and hear me out here, we would expect to see more diversity in response than, and the reality is that the results were sort of all over the map on that one study. If you actually look at the points instead of the median line, there is a lot of range. But you'd still expect to see more differentiation between individual girls than we do based on individualism. And you'd still expect to see more differentiation than we do among certain classes of boys, certain, subdivisions among boys. And yet we don't. And that implies that there is some sort of social cues or some sort of social training at work beyond people's, individual inclinations. And that's the concern. And so I just want to caution people when you talk about groups of people and you start talking about what is natural and you start talking about what is natural for women, you're going to lose me right there. Because my experience of being me and what is natural for me is none of this stuff that you guys are claiming should be natural for women. I am an individual. And when you start taking someone's gender over who they are as an individual, then that is an issue. And that's something we have to watch. That's precisely why I talk about this stuff and tell my story. And, you know, stand up and go, no, I like video games and I like action movies and I like these, I like tech, you know, I like gadgets, I like science, I like documentaries, you know, all these things that women aren't quote unquote supposed to like. But it's isolating. It's isolating and it's exhausting to constantly be treated as weird. And I can understand why a lot of people wouldn't want to do it. And that's very disappointing as somebody who's had to give up things I enjoyed because the social and work environment was lousy. I know how hard that is, and I know how much of a failure you feel because it wasn't that you weren't good at the work. You couldn't navigate all the other things surrounding it. And that pivots me to the content I did this week on the Jian Ghomeshi apology case. Now, some people got where I was going with it, and that's really good. There was a contingent that, and I was very careful what comments I approved and which ones I didn't. And I'm still second guessing myself, but what's done is done in terms of approvals. I'm not questioning the ones I didn't approve. I'm questioning the ones that I did. Because there were some people who were quite passionate about the things I wrote, but their comments weren't about the Catherine Burrell case. They were about the other trial that concluded with a verdict. And so I got these comments. The women were lying and this, that, and the next thing. That's a different case. And one of the things I've said on this issue, including the Lauren Southern segment I did that is out now on The Rebel, that, you know, it isn't about, I believe, survivors in court. It's the specific facts of the specific case and the specific people. And so I've got people quoting the Judge Horkins decision when Horkins wasn't even the judge sitting on, I think the guy's name was Lippman or something like that, but it wasn't even the same judge. And there are some people who even did, another comment says, you did say the woman lied in court, so isn't it a double standard? Like, no, Catherine Burrell never lied in court. She never appeared in court under oath. And this, I think it's more to this than just being mistaken. I think there's an element of confirmation bias going on here. And this is the difficult to navigate element of the work I do. That a lot of the stuff I work with, be it, you know, these accessibility issues, the disability stuff, the social, I hate saying social justice because it makes me want to put on a superhero cape and go fight crime. But sort of the idea of access as well as mental health stigma, which is super important to me because I've seen really brilliant people not be able to access the various services they need to be their best selves. These are things people don't want to talk about. They're difficult, they're challenging, they're upsetting in some ways. Anybody with an ounce of empathy doesn't want to feel as bad as some of these things make us feel. And I don't choose to focus on the doom and gloom, as you guys know. I like to focus on solutions and I like to focus on successes. But every so often you get a case like this Jian Ghomeshi thing that was just a massive systemic failure. And I'm not talking about court. I'm not. He's not going to see a day in jail. you roll the dice, you take your chances. I'm talking about the confirmed issues in his unit at the CBC that he's admitted to. Like, this is not a question of who's telling the truth here. There are a general agreement of facts from both sides on this one. And yet I still see people predominantly on Twitter trying to make Catherine Burrell out to be a liar. And I don't understand this. Even Ghomeshi himself is admitting she was telling the truth. And if the guy who did it is saying she told the truth, then why are people out there trying to make her into a liar on his behalf? And I don't want to immediately say, well, they're all misogynists, they all hate women. I don't think that's it. I think that I know there are some people acting on past traumas that they themselves experienced. They had a problem with false accusations or female bullies at work, which is why I worked very hard in the thing I wrote to indicate that, the people that do this sort of toxic workplace behaviors aren't all men. I personally had a run-in with, I'd say 2.5 different women. Well, 3, but it was like 2 full-on horrible people and 2 half horrible people who were women, who were female executives. I've also had real issues with executives who are in positions of power in name only. They won't make decisions because they're all, well, I have to make the other executives think it was their idea. And that's the way they got anything done. And it's, how do I put it? I've worked with quite a few female executives. I've worked with male executives. And I've never heard, I need to make the other people think it was their idea from a male executive. And it's really frustrating when that happens because you're looking at this person who was totally cool to you before they entered that job. And then all of a sudden they're a facilitator for bad behavior because they're more concerned about their job and continue to pull that high 6-figure paycheck than doing what's right, than actually being a leader. And that's really tough when you're in situations like that. And so, what's happening in terms of the backlash, the second wave of backlash, even though the facts are not in dispute in this second round of Ghomeshi drama, but the reactions are the same despite it. People are lumping her in with the other 3 women. And the reason the trials were separated is because there was a similarity of facts in the first 3. It was all dates. There was all choking or smacking alleged. It was all in romantic situations. This was completely different. This was at work. And, I said on the video and people missed it anyway. People kept saying, it's not rape, it's not rape, it's not rape. And I said off the top, 2nd-degree sexual assault isn't rape. A person in the province of Ontario can be charged with 2nd-degree sexual assault for having sex with a student. Non-violent, allegedly consensual sex under a certain age. It is automatically 1st-degree sexual assault if the student is under the age of 13. If they are older than 13, so if a 35-year-old woman sleeps with a 15-year-old boy, that is 2nd-degree sexual assault. And for those of you wondering off the top, one of the things I'm trying to do in my consulting and my outreach work is find ways to talk about workplace inclusion that don't treat people like idiots and don't create these boring seminars that nobody wants to go to. You take one of my my workshops, they'll be fun. And nobody will be treated like an automatic aggressor, and nobody will be treated like they're, a terrible person, or that all men are possible rape. None of that. No. Because that's not my approach. But I've heard stories about people who have had to sit through these things, and they're awful. And so people get this aversion to talking about things completely. And you'll hear people say, yeah, there's things that need to be done. Yeah, the system's not perfect. But the minute you ask them to do a single thing to try to make anything better for somebody else, they shut down because it's become so unpleasant, because there's this weird, everybody gets triggered on this subject. And I get that change is hard, but if you look how far we've come in just, our lifetime on, say, the subject of gay rights. I mean, good God, it's changed so quickly. And so we can make these changes. We can make these improvements together. And this is why I like saying, inclusivity and access as opposed to diversity. Being inclusive or being accessible is allowing new ideas in the door. And that's the entire point of having people who come from different circumstances. And, the reality is that now, I mean, what do top firms do? What do these big businesses do? We'll take people who are different, provided they look different, but their resume is identical to the people we already have. And the problem with that is if everybody's coming through the same incubator, they're going to be trained to think the same way. And because people, when they are insecure, want sameness. And so the goal is to broaden your concept of what is same or what is an extension of yourself. So if you're one of these people who is hesitant to condemn Jian Ghomeshi and hesitant to believe Catherine Burrell because you've been taken so many times and felt sympathy for people who turned out to be not credible, I want you to stop thinking about this as a situation of sexual assault, because it's not essential that's looked at it that way for you to understand what happened there. I want you to think of it as an instance of workplace bullying, which people of all genders and walks of life can understand. Because that's what it was. This was workplace bullying. This was somebody dominating another person for various reasons and various techniques in the workplace. Now we start thinking about that. It's not a question of listen and believe survivors. It's not a question of all these, activist catchphrases and hashtags or anything like that. It's something we can very much understand. He was a bully and she was bullied. And I think we all recognize that we don't behave perfectly when we're bullied. We do a lot of things to try to make it stop that make us look bad in the long run because we're desperate and we're just trying everything because the basics didn't work. It was documented at her place of work that she did report it. She did attempt to let people know. All this stuff is documented. We don't have to believe her. There's evidence. And apparently the CBC did comply with a request to hand it over. We never got those documents because it never went to trial, but they did release them. So there is paperwork on this one. It's all there. The CBC itself issued an apology to Catherine Burrell. Nobody is denying this happened. This woman was bullied at work. It was using sexual tactics in the bullying. But if that makes you too freaked out, you can see her, you can relate to her as someone who was picked on. Okay? And that's what really matters, because this is not shades of gray. It happened. It's very rare that we ever get something that there is so much consensus over the facts. It's not a he said, she said. He and she agree, as do third parties. So we really have to question why people continue to knee-jerk on this. It's about as corroborated as you can get. Really makes you think, doesn't it? But I'm going to stop there because this took a lot longer to unpack than I expected. But Feedback Fridays are tough because I'm going through 4 days of content. But thanks, guys. Looking forward to your feedback on the question off the top. And have a good weekend.